I first came to Singapore in the late 60s, quite a long time ago. And my memories are filled with pictures of colonial buildings, the Bugis markets, life being slower in many respects than other places that I had visited up till that time. And it was some 20 years before I returned in the 80s. Things had begun to change. Certainly the Singapore shoreline along the river was undergoing transformation. Bigger new commercial buildings were creeping along Orchard Road. The airport had increased and become one of the busiest in the world already at that stage. There was a whole lot more traffic on the roads. It was another 20 years before I came back again, almost anyway. And Singapore had changed so much, I completely lost my bearings once I reached the CBD. I didn't know where I was. I was grateful when I saw a Raffles Hotel to one side, or some other building that I recognised dimly from the past, but I just got lost. So much had altered. As I met with people, I found that life had quickened. Their schedules were busier, and not just watches were in evidence now, but mobile phones and all the other technical devices that we're very accustomed to. When I was searching the web fairly recently for a course I taught at BGST on issues of time and other related everyday challenges, I came across a little quote or logo, busyness / that's life in Singapore. It was a kind of boast, actually. It was not a complaint. And I thought, well, that's interesting. When I first taught at BGST, I noted how many students arrived late in the evenings to courses, not because they were slack, not because they didn't know the time, not because they were uninterested, but simply that the demands of work took precedence and often ate into their desire to be present. When I tried to arrange appointments with a range of people, it took generally 3 or 4 attempts to find a common time. That was something I was not unused to from my own country, but I hadn't experienced in quite the same way in Singapore before. The busying up of life and the quickening of life is something which is happening in all advanced economies. Singapore is not unique in that respect. But as I dug deeper into what was happening in Singapore, partly through talking to people, partly through looking at statistics, partly through just reading generally about what was taking place, I learned something I hadn't appreciated before, and that is that Singapore is among the top 2 or 3 busiest cities in the whole world. Some say it is now the busiest. Others say it's the second. A few say it's the third. It's somewhere between any of those, but certainly way at the top. And that's why I want to focus on how this affects the way in which we live generally, how the rest of our life is affected by this increasing pressure and pace of life, particularly in and through the workplace. How much are Christians affected by this, or do they somehow slip through the net and avoid it? What are the main reasons for this being the case, and what effects does it have upon our lives? And who should take responsibility for doing something about it, and why? And why quickly, actually, just to add further pressure to the problem. I looked up the Federal Reserve Economic Data website and found that Singaporeans worked longer than people in Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, They work about a quarter longer than Americans do, and almost half as long again as people in Europe do. That's quite a significant difference. There is an Employment Act, which you all know, operating in Singapore, which stipulates that people should work 44 hours per week. For the majority of Singaporeans, just averaging the whole population, this is no longer true. People in general work at least 45 to 50 hours a week. That doesn't sound too bad, but it doesn't count work done while commuting, work done at home, or work done on weekends or on holidays. This adds several further hours a week. A significant proportion of people, particularly those who are professionals, graduates, people in middle management positions, people who are self-employed, tend to work another 10 to 15 hours a week on top of all of this. And even more if their work involves regular overseas travel, as it increasingly does for many people. 31-year-old banker. Nowadays jobs are very demanding. You need to know everything and to do everything. If not, then you are out. A 30-year-old manager. It's not that I want to work till so late, but I have no choice. There are so many things to do. If I were to stop at 5 and go home, I would never be able to finish my work. Towards the end of 2014, Morgan McKinley conducted a survey of working hours in Singapore and found that 85% of those who responded felt that excessive working hours were impacting their work-life balance. 82% of professionals said that excessive work hours had been stipulated in their contracts. That was something that they had to do, they had no choice. Only 28% of those who put in excessive hours felt that they were more productive in those extra hours. And in fact, and this was a surprise to me, productivity in Singapore is rated as lower per hour than in Japan, in Hong Kong, and even in China. So people are working longer, but not necessarily producing more. Some of the comments that people made, here's a 28-year-old auditor. There's no way I can keep up with my work if I leave at 5. It's normal to stay back till 7 or 8 plus every day. Even when I go home, I still have to work on my laptop. Or a 25-year-old single assistant manager. After work, usually by the time I reach home, it's already late. So I'll have my dinner and rest for a while, maybe watch some TV, and then finish up some work for the next day. There are, of course, flexible workplace options. They've been around for some time. A Kelly Global Workforce Index at the end of last year found that while over 50% of people were aware of flexible work-life options, only a small proportion of them actually took them up. Even though 45% of younger Singaporeans said they'd prefer a more flexible schedule than more money, nevertheless, this was not always able to be taken advantage of. A full quarter of the population say there are currently no flexible work arrangements where they work. 40% of workers say that they chose not to use their company's initiatives for work-life flexibility because they were concerned they would receive an inferior performance review. As one person said, it would jeopardise my career. When you try and track how much time Singaporeans spend on work outside their regular workplace hours, a Robert Half Singapore survey found that 70% plus work at home, work on holidays, which is higher than the regional average in this part of Asia. People don't work so much outside the workplace in other countries nearby. When they were asked why this was the case, around 70% said, well, there could be an emergency at work, so I need to be available. About 60% said, well, it means there's less stress upon me when I get back into the workplace, so I soak it up in advance. About the same percentage said, well, my technology enables me to access work information from anywhere in the world, so why not? At any time. Almost half said that even on holidays they preferred to stay on top of work issues and therefore eat into their vacation time. About a quarter said, I just find it impossible to switch off. I suspect that that figure is actually higher, but at least a quarter admits that that is the case. Oops. A quote, "The phenomenon of the 24/7 workplace has been made possible by technological advancements, which has led to higher connectivity, faster turnaround time. This is undoubtedly an advantage for business competitiveness, but the pervasiveness of constant work connectivity means an erosion of personal space, it means higher stress levels, and it means an overall decline in the quality of life for such people." An interesting little test is to ask the question, how many people are actually willing to turn down a job because they felt it would affect the rest of their life too adversely? There was a survey done by the research company Accenture that appeared in the Straits Times 2 or 3 years ago, and they found that around 75% of women have in fact turned down a job due to work-life balance stress. For men, it's much lower. Nearly 50% had thought about it, and a proportion of them had actually done it. But the pressure in the workplace, even in companies which have flexible work options, means that this only happens rarely. And there tends to be a fitting in with the demands of the job and the employer, rather than drawing a line in the sand and saying no more, I resign. The most hopeful sign is that amongst younger Singaporeans, there's now a much greater emphasis upon work-life balance than their elders. Singapore's 4 main universities have been followed over the last few years to see what graduates are thinking about this, and each year the proportion of younger graduates concerned about work-life balance has increased. It's now, according to their own estimate, the top determining factor amongst about 2/3 of them in making a career choice. I suspect that doesn't always translate into the actual career choice which is made, but it's the attitude that they bring to the career that they choose. It's highest, actually, this desire for work-life balance amongst business students. It's actually lowest among students of engineering. One of the most interesting finds is that many younger Singaporeans now wish that life was more like it used to be in Singapore 20 years ago or 30 years ago. They prefer a less hectic lifestyle, shorter hours, more family time, something that would result in less stress, less competition. Well, where do Christians fit into all of this? But before that, who was most affected anyway? As I mentioned, those in professional work, those in middle management positions, women in particular who hold down responsible jobs, these are the ones who feel the pressure more than anyone else. In some Asian countries, this pressure is mitigated by a cultural perspective that prevents people from being as fully involved and giving themselves as fully to their work. In Indonesia, as you know, they talk about rubber time or elastic time, time where you have room to move, room to breathe, room to expand what you're not doing as well as doing. Much less so do you hear this kind of language used in a country like Singapore. So far as I can judge, and this is true in my own country as well, Christians are not exempt from any of these pressures that tend to threaten work-life harmony. In fact, they often have additional responsibilities in churches, in Christian organisations. They're often more involved in community and service commitments. If you talk to Christian leaders, they will generally talk about the pressure of time that they feel. They don't have enough to do all that they want to do, and often they don't have enough to do the main things that they want to do, or to do those things really well and thoroughly. They will talk about the pace of ministry becoming more hurried and hectic, how it's more difficult to keep up with all that's going on and all that you need to know or all you need to connect with. They find it harder to maintain peace in the midst of constant activity and to find time just to take pleasure and joy in what it is that they're doing. They feel frustrated that they don't have enough time for God or their families. They're anxious that they may not successfully accomplish all their key goals. And they live at a pace which often results in nervous tension of a fairly high kind, physical fatigue, and at its worst, of course, emotional burnout. Compounding the problem for Christians are three basic beliefs. The first of which is that busyness is a Christian virtue. This is a lie. For most of Christian history, busyness has been regarded as negatively as laziness. Whether you do too much or you do too little, it has exactly the same result. You don't focus on exactly and only what God wants you to do. We tend to think that doing too little is what causes such behaviour, but doing too much does it just as well. If it prevents us from giving our full attention and energy just to what God wants us to do, then it is no better busyness than laziness. In fact, the high value we place on busyness is a sign of how much we've conformed to the spirit of our age. I'll say a little bit more about that later in reference to a particular biblical verse which has been translated in the last 20 to 30 years in a way that nobody could have, even in their wildest thoughts, translated it in the previous 20 centuries. So busyness is not a Christian virtue. In fact, it is one of the 7 deadly sins. Sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins, is defined, or was defined in the Middle Ages, as doing too much as doing too little. Secondly, we have bought into the view that time is a commodity that we use, not a gift which we should receive respectfully and carefully prioritise. The only difference between us and non-Christians in this respect is that we set aside some of our time for church and Christian organisations, but we can become consumers of time and consumers of what they offer just as much in those settings as anywhere else. Our language betrays us here. Like everyone else, we talk about spending time. It's a commercial metaphor. Investing time. Saving time. Buying time. Purchasing time. All words drawn from the world of commerce. We even go further than that quite often and fall into the danger of extracting the maximum out of time, the very last ounce that we can get, which means that we are exploiting it as much as we do any other physical resource. Sometimes we talk about mortgaging time off. Selling the future in advance. I caught an annual planner once in somebody's lounge room, living room. Couldn't believe it. It's in all sorts of things on living room walls, but never an annual planner. January through to December, and it was all marked off. Not all, but about 2/3 to 3/4 marked off. And I thought how extraordinary that so much of the coming year was already given away. It was already determined. What I thought would happen if God wanted to get in on some of those spots which were already marked off in advance, given away to all sorts of probably very worthy causes. It reminded me too much of the passage in James. Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. But, says James, but you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Instead you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and you brag, and all such boasting is evil. I don't think I'd have minded if, seeing that annual planner, there'd been lots of question marks over all these, well, this is what we think we might be doing. We will see whether that is the case as we get closer. We'll be trying to sense what God is asking or not asking us to do, but there were no question marks. We justify such behaviour by sometimes referring to biblical verses like Proverbs 6:6, go to the ant, thou sluggard, as it used to say so beautifully in the King James Version. It doesn't sound anywhere near as good in more recent ones. But we overlook the fact that this is addressed to the idle, to the lazy, not to people who have a life which is properly involved in what God wants them to do. So we import our own ideas of busyness into the passage. Or think of Ephesians 5:15-16, often cited in this connection. Let me just read it to remind you. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Well, there are several problems here. First of all, making the most of every opportunity. This is the passage I was referring to a few moments ago. This does not appear in the text. Nobody ever translated it this way until 20 or 30 years ago, and it was Americans who did it, because that's the way they live. It's not making the most of every opportunity, it is simply redeeming the time, because the days are evil. In other words, doing things which are productive, which are right, which are good, which are honest, which are true, which are worthy, which are just. You can import other words from other parts of Paul to fill this out. Using the time to do those sorts of things, it's not anything to do with making the most of every opportunity. Nowhere in the passage are we encouraged to be busy, to hurry, to be quick, to speed up. All we are asked to do is to be wise and not foolish, to be discerning and not just flowing with whatever is happening around us. And in fact, what we're asked to do is to understand what the will of the Lord is. So it's a passage which has been hijacked. There's a third reason that we Christians tend to go in the wrong direction here. We think time is neutral, and it's subject to our choice as to what we do with it and what effects will come out of that. We view time as a kind of blank space, waiting to be filled with what we put into it, hopefully what we, in God's name, put into it. Now, this is partly true, but it's not the whole truth. It's not a blank space. Time is something which is already full of certain resonances. There's a rhythm built into the way our bodies operate. There's a rhythm built into the way the world itself operates, which scientists have been gradually, biologists in particular, discovering more and more about. There's a rhythm to the way relationships work. There's a rhythm to the way in which we absorb certain experiences in a way that makes a difference to our lives and allows them to really deeply affect us or change us. All of which is on the edge of the thinking of the Old Testament writer of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3:1, where he says, "There is a time for everything, and for everything there is a time." Time is not just a blank space. Mostly we approach things the other way around. We look at our watch and we say, how much time do we have? What can we fit into it? Instead of looking at the various things around us, work, family, relationships, appreciating God's world, fellowship, etc., and asking, how much should we be giving to these things? And, what time is there, or when is the time that we should be giving something of ourselves to these? This is why somebody pointed out many years ago, too often the things that are really pressing or urgent tend to take precedence in our lives over the things that are really important, enduring and profound. The tyranny of the urgent, as it was called. So these are the sorts of things which infect our Christian thinking and behaviour, and mean that we too are also drawn into this web of time pressure and the pace of life. At least as much, if not sometimes more, than the people around us. Now, apart from those, what are the more general causes of our problem here? Well, older technologies certainly tended to push us in this direction, ones that we don't even think about terribly much now. The electric light. Before the electric light, most people could not work at night. That's why you have biblical phrases like Paul saying, night comes when no one can work. You could light a candle, but they were so poor, so smoky, that you did your eyesight in if you relied too much on them to work by. So most people shut down when the day shut down. And they only got going again when the day started up. So the electric light made a huge difference. People began to colonise the night with work as much as during the day. The wristwatch. It's getting a bit old hat now. It's all in our phones, but the wristwatch made it possible to arrange appointments and create schedules down to the smallest fractions. Nobody until about 60, 70 years ago ever made an appointment for 3:20 in the afternoon. It meant nothing. In fact, pretty much until the 18th century, the only clocks that were around had hour hands and no minute hands. You couldn't possibly do it. It was just not on. The electric light, wristwatches, but then came the car, the train and the plane. All of which meant that we could travel more, travel quicker, travel to a whole range of places and increase our activities by a huge amount. So time was already speeding up under the old technologies, but the new ones have really exponentially made a difference. They often came in promising to reduce our workloads and give us more time, but it's not generally the way it's worked out. In fact, the very opposite has been the result. We now have digital watches, which lack the cues which give us a sense of time passing according to a certain sort of rhythm or period. You could see your watch going around the day and get a sense of that in a way in which a digital watch will never give you any such cues. It makes a difference to how we view time. Computers, meaning that we can switch them on and off, access what's going on anywhere in the world at any point of time. iPhones, smartphones, and whatever newer phones are on the way. Now, with multiple applications, means that we can do all sorts of things with this little device in our hands. They've become wedded to us. I still can't get over seeing people in shopping malls or getting off trains, watching them, totally absorbed in them, even as they walk. Just unaware of what is going on around them and just taking all their cues from whatever it is in their hands. It means now we can be contacted by anyone, anywhere, anytime. A huge invasion of personal privacy if we let it happen. These new technologies have some other effects as well. It's not just that they have made so many things more possible, but they have quickened the pace of life. James Gleach wrote a book which was noted quite widely called Faster, the acceleration of just about everything. That came out in 1999, so it's already old hat. Think how much things have speeded up in the last 16 or 17 years. And one of the things he noticed was that life has now got so much faster for so many people that running late has become the norm. It's a bit like that old saying that you sometimes used to see or hear in Christian circles: God put me on this earth to accomplish a certain number of things, but right now I'm so far behind I will never die. Another effect of the new technologies is that they blur the distinction between the different aspects of our lives: work, family, friendship, church, leisure, culture, and all the rest. Another author, Annie Hochschild, has written about this, or one aspect of it, in her book The Second Shift, when work becomes home and home becomes work. It becomes harder and harder to preserve the distinctions between the different compartments of our lives. Not that they should always be kept completely separate, I'm not wanting to suggest that, but when they get fused and overlaid in a way that makes it very difficult to know which you are in, am I in the work mode, in the home mode, the friendship mode? What's going on when I'm with my friend and my phone rings and I pick it up and I answer the phone and my friend just has to pick up their phone and answer their phone. What's taking precedence? What's actually going on in my life? And all of this has other effects as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what contributes to all of this is not just the technologies themselves, but other things that we or our organisations bring to the mix. We, for example, make a choice in favour of doing over becoming, doing things over becoming someone. We make a choice between wanting to do things really thoroughly, no matter what other people think, or do things in a way which will gain their attention and their recognition, even though they may not be the most important things, or they may not be always done in the way in which they should be done, just to their satisfaction, or which might be done in a way which does some kind of disservice to us, because it just takes too much out of us. We now live in a time when increasingly, and this affects Christians as well as others, people find their identity in and through their work rather than in and through things which are more profound. This is very dangerous for any Christian, because we know in our very kind of heart of hearts that we can never be justified by works. But that's kind of religious works. So we think, no, we're not being justified by anything we do religiously. We put that to one side. No, we're justified only by one work, and that is the work of Christ. That's the only thing which justifies. There's no work that we do ourselves. But then we can still go out and place our own sense of what is important, our own identity, of what justifies us to others, of what makes us acceptable to others, in the secular work, the ordinary work, the everyday work, the week-a-day work that we do. So we kind of live religiously here, ruling out spiritual good works, but the rest of the week, it's ordinary works which give us our sense of acceptance and importance and identity, proof that we're someone who is worthwhile. So we are partly to blame. Organisations are partly to blame, particularly if the value of the organisation is that unless you work longer and harder than others, you are not really committed to this firm, this company, this department. It's a sign that you're not really with us. This is also a lie. Governments are partly to blame, not just individuals, not just organisations, but governments, by focusing increasingly upon economic matters as if they're the only things that really count. Calculating everything in either economic or monetary terms. Productivity being the thing and the only thing which really matters in the long run. Wider cultural expectations are part of the problem. The new is always better than the old. Well, I'm not so sure. This is the first age which has ever thought that. Speed is to be valued more than slowness. Really? There are certain things which can only be done slowly, at least if they're to be done well. They can't be done quickly. The growth of globalization is part of the problem, because now so many people have to work on somebody else's time zone schedule. I might live in Los Angeles, but I have to work London times. Shift work, we used to call it, has become the norm for many people, particularly in technologically driven industries around the world. The problem is that it doesn't do very much for your health. It doesn't do very much for your relationships. It's bad for your family life. It creates all sorts of physical, psychological and relational problems, which have been well documented and known for several decades. Churches are partly to blame. Churches are to blame when they keep adding things into their programs which they need people to do, and they ask people to do these on top of all the other things that they're doing without asking the question whether they have the time, whether these things are the most important things to do, whether these things should be done somewhere else than on church property, perhaps out there in the community at large, where people actually live and move and have their being. Churches can be part of the solution, but at the moment some of them are actually also part of the problem. These are some of the causes. They're quite complex. There's just no one single factor that's involved here. And the effects too are also varied and complex. I've mentioned one or two areas in which studies have been done of the effects of all this upon people, but now if you put together what's been looked at in biology, in psychology, sociology, in healthcare, in education, in medicine, etc., a quite disturbing picture actually begins to emerge. Busyness and too much pace of life has serious physical and psychological consequences for a start. It's now estimated that the number one health problem in developed countries is insomnia. People can't get to sleep. And if you don't get enough sleep, it affects you in a very serious way. I'll say more about that in the course than I can here. What doctors in some countries call hurry sickness, which business people are particularly prone to and often affects them on on Sunday mornings when they want to go to church. They're just addicted to being in a hurry. Type A personalities are particularly prone to this. There's an increase in the number of strokes which people suffer, much of which has to do with the pace of life. Heart disease is also affected by this. People die too early, people die too young. It's now affecting women almost as much as men. So physical and psychological consequences are a result of this whole problem. But it also affects our judgment, our discernment, our decision-making capacities. It means that more of us make snap judgments about things because we don't have time to make judgments which take into account all the evidence or a longer-term perspective. It means that we have less vigilance when we're involved doing certain things, and this is what lies behind a lot of traffic accidents. People just aren't concentrating enough, and of course if you've got one of these in your hand and you're doing something with it, that makes it even worse. It affects even what you purchase. Marketers now know that the bigger the item, the more expensive the item you're going to buy, probably the less time you'll actually spend thinking about whether to get it, because you don't have the time to do it. You'll grab something before you've had enough time to really consider the quality, the evidence, the warranty, etc., the competition, the alternatives, whether you actually need it or something else would do the job better. That's just one example of how it affects our judgments, but it also reduces our capacity to do serious thinking. We don't have the time for it. To gain wisdom, we don't have the time to actually process the things which would give us something like that. To become creative, that takes a little bit of time. You can't just turn it on and off. It's impossible. So these are some of the effects as well. It also prevents too many people from experiencing some of the basic things in life which are really crucial to what it is to be a person. For example, rest. Rest. Not just sleep, but rest. I came across a little article written by a Singaporean called Rest, the 4-letter word in Singapore. You don't talk about it. It's like using a swear word. People will be shocked if you say this is becoming something which I'm missing, or it's important, or that I actually experience it. Rest we miss out on. Play we miss out on. Play is actually crucial for being a healthy, normal, creative person. We've replaced play with the work out. Note the terms, work out. It's become work. And much play is competitive, not collaborative. We miss out on dreams because we're not sleeping enough, so we don't dream enough. But dreams help resolve all the things that are going on during the day. They kind of sort them out and put them to bed, so to speak. Dreams are often the trigger for new ideas, new possibilities, new opportunities, new discoveries. But if you don't dream, you won't have these, or you'll have them a whole lot less. Not to speak of relationships with spouse, children, colleagues, friends, with junior workers whom you might mentor, with fellow believers. All of these are affected as well. Work-life disharmony, busyness and too pressured and quick a pace of life is actually a sign of our inability to manage our lives, not a sign of how much we've got it all together and how much we're actually achieving. Being busy is not the same as being productive, as somebody said. And it's more often used as a guise for avoiding the few critically important but uncomfortable actions we should be involved in. It's not just that it's a sign of inability to manage our lives, it's also an indicator of our lack of confidence and self-worth, because we're trying to make ourselves feel we're okay, as I mentioned before. I wear it like a badge, said somebody. I quickly resort to saying how busy I am when people ask how my life is, yet in reality, busyness was just another addiction that I clung to avoid the things that made me feel uncomfortable. Well, let me pull this together by asking in conclusion, what do we need to do and who needs to do it? We need to start by stepping back and reframing the whole question. We pose the question, as I did in the title of this talk, as an issue of work-life harmony or balance. But it's the wrong way round. It should be actually, what is the correct life-work balance or harmony? Life is what's crucial, not work. Work is important, but it's not the most basic thing in life. It's part of what we should be involved in. It's not the point from which we should start and seek to view everything. So we have to turn the whole thing round and start looking at it in another way. Where does work fit into what I understand to be what I should be coming with my life and doing with my life? And when we put it that way, the second step we need to take is to look beyond ourselves, thinking that it's just a personal problem. I have a problem with time. I have a problem with business. I have a problem with balance or harmony. I probably do, but in the long run, I cannot solve it myself. if I try and solve it just myself, I will fail because there are too many other factors involved. There are too many other people involved. I don't have the full capacity to do it on my own, even if I pull God in and ask for his help. I need other people to actually help me resolve this whole issue. I need other organisations that I'm connected with to help me resolve this issue. People who should be involved in helping to sort through this tangle of difficulties are those who are not just using technology, but making technology. Instead of simply creating or using products which we assume are better because they're new and faster, do they always add value? What do we lose as well as what do we gain? Discernment is needed to work out in what ways these really improve and enhance life, or in what ways they distract and take something crucial away from our lives. This is just another version of Jesus' biblical question about whether the Sabbath was made for man or man for the Sabbath. Was technology made for us, or were we made for technology? As I look around, I see increasingly we were made for technology. That's the way people tend to be using it. Somehow it's the master. It controls us. I read the other day that in my own country, there's a whole swathe of people who check their phone 250 times a day. 250 times a day. Who is the master here? Who is actually in control? In other cultures, if somebody did that, they would say, this is your God, because you refer to this more than anything else that you do. Anyone else that you actually are in relationship with. This is far more important than any of them. People who are cultural spokesmen have something vital to contribute here. Those who can speak, whether they're preachers, writers, teachers, commentators in written or public or visual media, to ask questions about this, to raise issues that might be involved underneath what appears to be always such a boon and an advance and progress. I don't hear many preachers doing it. And just to choose one group. We need people in our workplaces. Yes, it's good that more flexible options have come into our workplaces. Flexible working hours, part-time options, working at home rather than in the office, etc. But these are not being taken up in huge measures yet, and not always taken up in ways which minimise the problem. Sometimes they enhance and deepen the issues. Churches need to be helping us here as well. Not adding to other people's time burdens, but finding ways of helping them to sort through them and actually reduce them. What if churches were less preoccupied with building up little empires of their own and looking for ways to equip their members to be and do what they should become and be involved in their homes, in their neighbourhoods, in their workplaces, in their wider communities. Turning the whole thing around and serving what's out there rather than pulling everything in and seeking to build something up that is here. Government bureaucracies could help here. One of the things that's come into place in the last 20 or 30 years has been environmental impact statements. If people have new ideas, new plans, new policies, well then built into the way they're assessed is generally, how will this affect the world in which we live, the land we walk on, the air we breathe, the water we drink or we swim in. Environmental impact. but I've not seen anywhere in any government of any country anywhere in the world that has introduced temporal impact statements. How will it affect the way in which people's time is lived? Will it increase the quality of the time that they have, or will it decrease the quality of their time? Mostly, new things which come in only add to our time burdens. More pieces of paper to fill out, more forms to mail or send through the computer, more bureaucratic things to respond to. Here's something for urban planners, for administrators and others to think seriously about. And finally, there's a role for Christian organisations and Christians generally. I've been thinking a lot lately about the fact that 300 years ago, it was Christians in Europe, in the first instance, who fought to keep one day a week separate from work. And they did it not just for themselves, so they could worship God on a Sunday. They did it for the whole population, because they felt everybody needed to have one day a week free of work. A century and a half ago, Christians joined in and were often at the forefront of the struggle for the 40-hour week. It wasn't just enough to have one day free from work, but you needed to have time free each day from work so it didn't invade too much of the hours of the evening. It's time that Christians stepped up to the plate again and found creative and persuasive ways, compelling ways of helping people keep work in its proper place and not intrude beyond the boundaries that it should really have. Help people to release time so they can properly fulfill the various roles, relationships, and other activities and obligations that they have outside the workplace. I'd like to go a step further. If, as it seems to be the case, Singapore is one of the 2 or 3 countries which is now most affected by this whole issue, then what better laboratory in which to try and find the solutions to it? Not just for your own sake, but for the sake of not just Christians, but people generally in other parts of the world, in other parts of Asia, in North America, in my own country, which is getting worse and worse in all these respects, in Europe, in Africa, etc., which is also being increasingly affected. Indeed, if Singapore is one of the 2 or 3 places where this problem is felt most keenly, not only do you have the opportunity to do something about it because you have all the evidence around you and all the effects felt inside you, but you have a divine obligation to do something about it. God's call is upon you because you are right there in the crucible of the problem. And you could do something which not only be beneficial to yourselves, but which people all over the world would bless you for. I was watching TV earlier today and that little ad came on, you've probably seen it, in which somebody talks about how Singapore is the first in everything, and it should be the first in this, and it should be the first in that, and it should be the first in the other. Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing to aim at. How about it be the first to really resolve what is becoming an increasingly difficult issue, which, if it's not resolved, is going to affect not only people everywhere, but affect people like you more and more, and your children and coming generations, in ways in which are going to be increasingly disturbing and serious. There I must end. Thank you.